Okay, so let's take a look at compound interest. So compound interest is interest that is earned on the principal and any previously accumulated interest as well. So you don't just earn interest on the amount that you invest, you also earn interest on interest. Okay, so you are earning interest on interest, which means over time you end up making more money. Okay, for compound interest, the number of times interest is compounded in a year can vary. So you can either get interest on an annual basis, so that's once a year, or semi-annual, which is twice a year, or quarterly, 4 times a year, monthly, 12 times a year, weekly, 52 times a year, bi-weekly, which is 26 times a year, or daily, which is 365 times a year. And so if you look at credit cards or bank accounts, some companies or some institutions charge interest differently. And so credit cards typically will charge interest in one manner. Your savings accounts might charge interest in a different manner. And so in compound interest, you have more flexibility in terms of how often you are earning the interest. Okay, so it's not just annually. In simple interest, you can only earn interest on an annual basis, but in compound interest, it can vary. Okay, so you can vary the number of times you earn interest in a year. Okay. So here's the compound interest formula. And so we'll talk about what each of these variables represent. And you'll notice that it actually creates an exponential function because you are multiplying by a certain factor over and over again over time. And so the compound interest formula is A equals P times 1 plus I to the exponent n. A represents the accumulated amount, just like it does when you're looking at simple interest. P represents the principal amount, just like it does in simple interest. I, however, represents the interest rate per compounding period. Now, what this means is that if you're earning interest, let's say you're earning let's say your interest rate is 6%, okay? But let's say your interest is compounded quarterly. So what that means is you're actually earning interest 4 times a year. Now, the interest rate per compounding period actually changes. So if you're earning 6% interest compounded quarterly, 4 times a year, that doesn't mean that you're earning 6% after the first few months, then 6% after the next few months, and then 6% after the next few months, and then 6% after the final few months. That's not what that means, because what that actually indicates is that you're earning 24% in interest. Okay? So what this means is, this is the total amount of interest, or the total percentage of interest you'll earn in 1 year. However, because your interest rate is compounded quarterly, let's say, what that means is every quarter, you're actually going to earn 1/4 of that interest. So what that actually means is every quarter of the year, you'll earn 0.015 in interest, okay, or 1.5% in interest. So 1.5% after the first 3 months, 1.5% after the next 3 months, 1.5% after the next 3 months, and then 1.5% in the last 3 months. Okay? In total, that gives you 6% in 1 year. Okay? So keep that in mind. I does not represent the interest rate that you're earning. It represents the interest rate per compounding period as a decimal. Okay, similarly, n is the number of compounding periods. So it tells you how many times you're earning interest. Okay? Or how many times the interest was compounded. So what that means is, depending on the number of times interest is compounded in a year, and depending on how many years you're investing for, the value of n will change. So let's say you're investing in an account that compounds interest quarterly, just like we saw previously, but let's say you're investing for 5 years. So what that means is you're going to earn interest 4 times a year for 5 years. Or in other words, you're actually going to earn interest 20 times over a span of 5 years. So that's one of the special things that you have in compound interest. Because the number of compounding periods can change, how often you earn interest and how often your interest is compounded can actually change the way the equation is written. Okay, so we'll look at some examples that will discuss that. Okay, so just to reinforce, the way the equation is written is actually solving for the accumulated amount of your investments. So let's say you invest $800. What A represents, once you actually solve the right-hand side of the equation, what A represents is the total amount of money you will have at the end of the investment period. Okay, so let's say you invest for 5 years. A will tell you how much money you have in your account at the end of those 5 years. Okay, it's slightly different than simple interest. In simple interest, you have to figure out how much interest you earn, and then you can figure out how much accumulated amount you have. In compound interest, you figure out how much you have in total, and then you can backtrack to figure out how much interest you earned. We'll talk about that later as well. Okay, the other part to this lesson looks at present value. And so what present value represents is the amount of money invested today to produce the desired amount in the future. So for example, let's say you want to save some money now so that you have $5,000 in a few years. So the amount of money you invest now is actually the present value of your investment. Or in other words,